Today we discover a story where a quiet life is shattered by an extraordinary secret. Samuel Washington, a humble hospital worker, loses his beloved wife Lorraine, only to find she's left behind not just memories, but a hidden fortune meant to change the world. Shock turns to courage as Samuel faces elite families, social prejudice, and the pressures surrounding his son's high-stakes wedding. In a breathtaking moment, dignity triumphs over wealth, reshaping relationships and forging an unforgettable legacy. Lorraine's fortune becomes a force for good, sparking a foundation that lifts children and unites communities. Grief gives way to hope as ordinary routines transform into lifelong impact, and one small family's love ripples through an entire city. Subscribe and hit like. Our powerful stories add years to your life. Join our Story Lovers Club and let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? There are moments when time itself seems to hold its breath, when the simplest sound can change everything, detonating silence into chaos. Kenneth's journey to his sister's new home had begun with pride, a sense of accomplishment that shimmered in his chest as he approached the compound's tall walls, wrapped in their crown of razor wire and vigilant cameras. He thought of the years they'd spent clawing their way out of poverty, the nights of shared hunger and whispered hope, the relentless determination that had propelled them both from the shadows of an abandoned tenement to the blinding light of prosperity. But all that optimism unraveled the instant he heard the crash. It was not an accidental tinkle of glass from a dropped cup or careless gesture. The shattering sound was deliberate, heavy, expensive, and violent. It echoed through the manicured gardens and opulent halls of David's luxury villa, like thunder, a foreboding herald of disaster. Kenneth's military instincts kicked in before his brain could catch up. He knew that glass breaks every day in every house, but the weight and purpose in this particular sound sent shivers down his spine. It spoke of hatred, not clumsiness. It suggested danger, not domestic mishap. Then came the voice. A man's voice, David's, thick with rage, slicing the air like a whip. Every word dripped contempt and fury, his anger gathering like a storm, ready to obliterate anything in its path. Kenneth recognized this timbre. He'd heard it in the camps, in emergency rooms, in the cries that reverberated through barracks and battlefield tents. It was the universal voice of a man asserting power by inflicting terror. Beneath the brutality, a woman's voice broke through, soft, desperate, pleading. Kim, his sister, was bargaining for safety, her words thin and frantic, as though she were reaching through a wall of fire, hoping someone would seize her hand before she burned. Kenneth's heart contracted in pain. There was no mistaking genuine fear. He'd spent years learning to distinguish between shouts of irritation and the music of true terror. He knew when someone was fighting for survival rather than for attention. As Kenneth paused at the gleaming gate, flanked by uniformed guards who nodded with indifferent politeness, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The compound itself was a monument. High gates, electronic locks, meticulously trimmed flowers, security systems fit for royalty. Truly, it was the kind of fortress that should have offered sanctuary from every ghost of Lagos: poverty, violence, abandonment. How ironic, Kenneth thought, that the most terrible monsters found ways inside regardless of the walls meant to keep them out. He stared at the polished path, the imported statues, the driveway lined with exotic plants, each a testament to David's wealth and Kemi's rise from obscurity. These were all the trappings she'd once envisioned in her darkest hours, when shared scraps of food and promises whispered in the night were the only nourishment their souls could claim. Now, everything seemed cheap in comparison to the sound that filled the air, a sound that mocked every sacrifice they've made and every hope that had carried them this far. And as Kenneth steeled himself, preparing to step into the heart of disaster, he realized that history was repeating. The predators they'd escaped as children had returned in another form, dominating, violent, hiding behind elegance and affluence. It was time for him to remember every oath he'd made and every lesson pain had taught him. Because on the other side of that door, where light and shadow danced across broken glass, even before Kenneth opened the heavy carved front door, he could feel the tension bristling through the marble floors and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The family's hard-won rise from the damp, narrow streets of their childhood haunts felt both a lifetime away and as close as the skin on his bones. Every detail that met his eyes as he entered was intended to declare victory over adversity. The imported rugs, the carefully curated art, the subtle but unmistakable scent of expensive flowers arranged in purposeful abundance. But today, all of that opulence was merely a backdrop, failing to dull the sharp undercurrent of fear that ran beneath it all, as tangible as a river in flood. There was a time when Kenneth and Kem had nothing but each other. Nights were spent in whispered confessions about hunger and hope, making promises that seemed laughable to anyone else. "We will make it," Kem would say, her small hand gripping his, eyes fierce with determination. Those words became their shared mantra, a lifeline that carried them past poverty's traps and into days when basic needs could be met, then into years when dreams finally, miraculously became real. The house, this house, was supposed to be the final proof of their triumph. Sitting behind its massive gates, guarded by surly men in pressed uniforms and surrounded by manicured gardens, the house shouted safety and dignity. Yet walking through the foyer, Kenneth was struck by how little the trappings of wealth mattered in the face of real fear. There is no security system sophisticated enough, no gate tall enough, no window strong enough to keep out the monsters that wear human faces and sit, smiling, at your own dinner table. The deeper Kenneth walked into the house, the clearer the evidence of conflict became. He saw the splintered frame of a picture, once a celebration of unity, now scattered in shards, a vase shattered, its long-stemmed flowers bleeding across the stone. Furniture shifted at unnatural angles suggested violence, not movement. It struck Kenneth that true violence almost always left these silent markers, clues that spoke to anyone who knew what to look for. He had seen enough barricaded rooms and ransacked shelters to read the signs that most would miss. And it was amidst these muted testaments to pain that Kenneth realized no amount of distance from the slums, no layer of money or prestige would ever guarantee true peace for those marked by hardship. The marks might change, might be hidden by silk and marble, but they always remained, waiting for a moment like this to tear through the fabric of illusion. Years in the service, years spent training and fighting and learning the art of survival. They had honed Kenneth's instincts into steel. Lessons bloom. He could read a room like a map, see the trajectories of disaster written in the debris, and he overheard fragments of raised voices. As he scanned the space, tracing every possible route David might have taken, every shadow Kem might have retreated into, he was filled with the cold, focused clarity that had kept him alive when others failed. He took in the details, the way the front door hung open, neither welcoming nor abandoned, but hurriedly left askew. The line of muddy footprints, suggesting someone had stormed through the house without concern for consequence. The subtle, acrid tang of fear that comes when violence has just occurred and the air itself hasn't settled. Kenneth catalogued every minor disturbance, noted them as if briefing himself before a mission. All the while the voices continued. David's words were now muffled, but distinctly cruel, filled with that dehumanizing edge that transforms argument into attack. Kem's response had gone quieter, softer, almost a whisper, but every word she uttered carried the unbearable weight of someone who knows she is not alone, who still hopes for rescue, even if hope feels faint and fading. Kenneth paused for a fraction of a second, recalling the code he and his sister once used as children. A series of knocks and clicks that meant danger in the language of the abandoned. His heart pounded as he listened, just in case the old signal would come, telling him exactly where to go and what to do. Instead, there was only a crash, a scuffle, the unmistakable thud of a body against wall. Every nerve in his body screamed a single urgent order: act now. He advanced, each step measured but hurried, moving like a shadow through the expensive gloom. Within the main living space, sunlight streamed through panoramic windows, the rays illuminating the dust of recently disturbed chaos. Overturned chairs sprawled across Persian carpets, and the remnants of a dinner party, a tipped bottle of wine, a half-eaten meal, looked eerily unchanged, as if some vital scene had suddenly bled violence into domestic routine. Kenneth's gaze moved from object to object, piecing together the story in the room. A vase once full of lilies hurled in rage. A glass sculpture, split as though symbolizing the fracture in a marriage. This was more than just a fight. This was control, anger, humiliation. Emotions Kenneth understood intimately from the years spent mediating disputes in places where guns were more common than words. Yet what hurt him most wasn't the destruction of things. It was the knowledge that the home his sister had poured her heart into had become another battleground. He remembered their tiny, unsafe flat, his restless nights pressing an ear to crumbling plaster to detect threats in the hallway, scanning for realities that wore different faces each year. The echo of their mother's voice, warning them both never to let anyone hurt the other, haunted him now. Kenneth had kept that promise again and again, first in the slums, then as a soldier, then as her guardian in every way that counted, except, it seemed, in the face of marital sanctity and social expectations. As light illuminated a single droplet of blood on the floor, Kenneth felt a surge of guilt. Was this what all those struggles had bought them, a future where despair wore designer clothes, and danger wrote its threats on imported silk? Was the quiet dignity they'd strived for so fragile, so easily ruined? The answer, he thought grimly, was yes, unless someone was willing to stand up and force destiny to yield. David, the man who stood in the middle of the chaos he had created, looked the part of both king and criminal. Expensively dressed, his carefully manicured fingers still trembled from the violence he'd unleashed. Lines of anger carved deep valleys into his face, twisting every handsome feature into something ugly and desperate. He met Kenneth's eyes with a look that flashed from arrogance to fear in a heartbeat. Suddenly, the gulf between their backgrounds seemed not vast, but paper-thin. In Kenneth's powerful frame and dark, disciplined certainty, David saw a reckoning he could not manipulate, could not buy off or dismiss with a show of bravado. The very walls seemed to tilt with the weight of confrontation, the room shrinking in on David as his own violence was mirrored back at him, not as power, but as shame. For a moment, a profound silence hung in the air, broken only by Kem's suppressed sobs from the corner where she had retreated. David's mask of civility, of dominance, even of love, slipped entirely in that instant, revealing not a husband or protector, but a frightened, small man in the shadow of a true defender. To Kenneth, the scene was heartbreakingly familiar. Those who harmed the innocent were always the weakest when exposed. Lessons bloom. The challenge in David's gaze faded, replaced by something brittle, haunted. The realization that he was no longer in control. This was not his palace anymore, not his narrative. In Kenneth's presence, he was only another man caught by the consequences of cruelty. The storm had broken. Now, in the suffocating aftermath, all eyes were on Kenneth, not just to punish, but to save, to restore, to remind everyone present that some battles, no matter how late they begin, must be fought to the end. Kem's body, curled tight in the crook of the couch, shook as if every bone inside her threatened to unravel. Her face bore the traces of tears, her eyes swollen yet blazing with a spark of stubborn dignity. An ember that refused to be fully extinguished even by fear. She and Kenneth had faced storms before, arm in arm in the dark, and this memory seemed to flicker in her eyes now, as she caught her brother's gaze. For a suspended moment, the siblings communicated without words. Kenneth noticed the way her hands searched the fabric, as if hunting for something steady in a sea of chaos. She flinched when David moved, instinctively raising her arm to protect her bruised cheek. That small, unconscious movement told Kenneth more than any confession could. It was the gesture of someone accustomed to ducking, someone who had lived with the repetition of violence. He felt keenly the failure implicit in Kem needing to defend herself, his personal oath tarnished by the fact that she had survived such moments alone. The urge to comfort her warred with his soldier's discipline. But right now, she needed his action, not his sympathy. Kem's voice, unusually steady, but still raw, cut through the silence. "Kenneth, please. She didn't finish the sentence. He recognized the weight behind those two words. A plea for freedom, for dignity, maybe even for revenge. She would not beg David for mercy or safety. That was not her way. Instead, she trusted her brother to do what was right and to reclaim the thin thread of control she'd been denied for too long. The air between them thickened with the ghosts of shared hunger and hope, with everything unsaid and every promise made in sleepless childhood nights. More than ever, Kenneth knew he could not, would not, leave his sister's side now. Whatever power David once held in this household evaporated in the knowledge of what true loyalty looked like. Kenneth reached for his sister's trembling hand, gently, firmly, offering a silent vow she would never be left alone in her battles again. David retreated, his swagger disintegrating with every backward step. He opened his mouth as if to issue a warning or a threat, but nothing came. The table, once carefully set for dinner, now stood as a silent witness to his defeat. Wine seeped into white linen, dark and spreading, like a metaphor for the secrets hidden behind lavish decor. The silence that filled the room was a living thing. It pressed upon David most acutely, reminding him that reputations, no matter how carefully curated in public, could not protect him from private reckoning. He watched Kenneth, not just a man in uniform, but the sum of everything David could never be. He saw Kem not as the compliant wife he'd intended to break, but as someone now shielded by history and blood. This was the silence Kenneth understood from years in hostile territory, a waiting, watching hush that stretches seconds to eternity, where every breath is loaded with consequences. He allowed it to stretch a moment longer, watching David squirm until the air seemed ready to crack. Finally, David spat. "This is our business. You have no right." Kenneth's interruption was a command, not an argument. "My right is the blood she bled to build this home. My right is every promise I made when we were children, every night we survived so we wouldn't have to see this day." His voice was low, yet rang with the weight of battles won and lost, not on foreign soil, but in the heart of family. David shrank from the confrontation, exposed for what he was, not a powerful man, but a scared tyrant, undone by the loyalty of those he thought he controlled. In that silence, the lie of his dominance echoed and died. For a split second, Kenneth's mind flashed back to their earliest years, a time when the world was no safer, but the enemy had worn a different face. Their father's absence had left a hunger that nothing material could fill. The relatives who should have protected them had instead used need as leverage, teaching both fear and resilience in equal measure. Kenneth remembered sneaking extra crusts of bread to Kem, inventing stories about a better future in the waning candlelight. Those nights had forged them into survivors, but they had also written into their bones a private code: never let anyone hurt us again. And now, here in this palace of false safety, the cycle sought to repeat. Kenneth felt the weight of generations, the violence, the domination, the way pain could pass like a family heirloom, unless someone broke the pattern. He looked to Kem and recognized in her the fatigue of someone who feared she might fall into the same darkness as the women before her. But this time, things would be different. This time, Kenneth would use every weapon learned in orphaned poverty and state-sanctioned war to cut that family curse at its root. He would not let the sins of the past become the inheritance of the future. He was ready to become what he must, even if it meant facing consequences in courts or in the eyes of those who would prefer silence to truth. In that moment, Kenneth realized that the real legacy wasn't the house, nor the money, nor even the respect of neighbors. The real legacy was whether they moved forward scarred but free, or chained forever to their trauma. The decision had to be made now, not just for Kim, but for every child like them who dreamed of a world without fear. Kenneth steadied himself, lifting his chin as he set boundaries that could not be crossed. He spoke with the calm of someone for whom violence was a last resort, but justice a certainty. David, you will not touch her again. Not now, not ever. I will not let another day pass with you as both jailer and judge in this house. David's eyes narrowed, scanning Kenneth for any trace of hesitation. Finding none, his own bravado crumbled further. His hands faltered at his sides, his body shrinking next to the mess he'd created. Kim, tears drying on her cheeks, straightened a little, emboldened by Kenneth's presence. She didn't say a word. Her silence was a powerful indictment of everything she'd suffered, and a declaration that she now believed in deliverance. Kenneth's mind darted. Should he call the police? Would they listen? Lagos was a city where justice often bent to the will of the highest bidder. But Kenneth's reputation carried weight with men in uniform. He would see that weight used for the right side for once. He pulled out his phone. Every second that passed was a victory. One that eroded David's power, shifting the axis of control slowly, inexorably, back toward justice. And Kenneth would not stop there. He would marshal friends and contacts, bend the attention of the world, if needed, until the safety of his sister was assured. Justice, Kenneth realized, starts not with the law, but with the refusal to look away. Today, justice would begin at this dining table amidst spilled wine and shattered glass. As the first notes of police sirens floated faintly through the humid Lagos morning, Kenneth felt the world begin to right itself. Kim, hands still trembling, managed a worn, grateful smile as she clung to her brother's arm. The simple physical contact, speaking volumes neither sibling needed to voice. The air was still thick with hurt and memory, but Kenneth could sense the turning, pain receding, hope daring to bloom again. He stood tall, feeling both the weight and the possibility of what would come next. They would need lawyers and social workers and perhaps months, years of healing. But for the first time, the future seemed to belong to them again, not to their fears. I am here, Kenneth whispered softly, his words not just to Kim, but to all the ghosts that haunted the halls. And I will stay until the shadows are gone. Outside, the city's distant noise grew louder as the authorities drew near. The gleaming walls of the house, once both sanctuary and prison, would witness a reckoning. But within those walls, beneath the gaze of ancestors and the gaze of children yet unborn, something new was being born. A promise remade, a legacy of hope at last wrested from the jaws of violence. Kenneth didn't let go of Kem's hand as officers entered. He stood as her shield, as he always had, defiant before a future that promised struggle, but now, at last, shimmered with possibility. And so, the chapters of the past closed, and the first words of freedom wrote themselves into the morning light. The police officers entered the residence in a disciplined line, their uniforms pressed and badges gleaming in the buttery glow of expensive chandeliers. They walked not as brutes, but as men and women trained to catalog chaos, to sniff out the shape of crime beneath the shroud of wealth. Kenneth met them at the threshold, his posture radiating both deference and command, the unspoken authority of a man who knew that sometimes law had to be reminded of its duty. David's face, ashen and drawn, fastened itself into a mask of injured dignity. He tried to summon outrage, his voice slithering toward accusation. This is an internal matter. My wife, my home. But even as he spoke, his words felt weak, crumbling in the shadow of official scrutiny. The senior officer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, raised a hand to silence him and turned instead to Kenneth and Kem. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the scattered evidence of violence. A broken vase, the wine-dark stains, Kem's bruised cheek. The interview began in quiet, clipped questions. How long? How frequent? What threats? What proof? Each answer was another nail in David's coffin, every honest word from Kem transforming her from victim to witness, and the house from a fortress to a crime scene. Kenneth watched as his sister hesitated just once, her voice trembling as she admitted the duration of her suffering. He squeezed her hand tightly, wordlessly pledging his strength whenever hers wavered. The officers, taking careful notes and photographs, marked the home's transformation. It was no longer just a backdrop to the powerful, but a place where justice could crawl in and perhaps take root. For the first time, the silence was not threatening. They were not alone anymore. Kem's voice, though cracked, was now accompanied by the firm, supportive words of her brother and the promise of law. The officers led David away with professional efficiency, neither shamed nor celebrated, simply processed like countless others who had fought their status, set them apart. He protested, shouted, invoked lawyers and connections, but the only response was protocol, the slow, grinding wheels of justice, indifferent to his threats. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some curious, some vindictive, but none intervening. The scene was as much a spectacle as a warning to those who lived behind similar walls, taught to hide their pain for the sake of respectability. Inside the house, Kenneth helped Kem to her feet. He guided her gently to a chair, fetched her water, and pressed a cool towel to her bruised face. Their conversation, low and careful, was woven with years of shared suffering and the halting hope of change. Kem apologized, as survivors so often do, for making a scene, for needing help, for being hurt. Each apology made Kenneth bristle with sadness and with resolve. He reminded her softly that love meant standing guard, not turning away. That pain endured alone was a wound, but pain faced together could become a scar, a mark of survival, not defeat. Kem's fear did not vanish, nor did the burden of shame. Healing would come in stutters and stops, with counseling, with nights plagued by memory, and mornings brightened by possibility. Kenneth promised to stay as long as he was needed, to rebuild what could be rebuilt, and honor what was lost to the violence of secrecy. Outside, the city pulsed on, oblivious but not untouched. Word would spread. If change was possible here, in this gilded prison, it could stretch further. Maybe, Kenneth thought, they had begun to break the cycle not just for themselves, but for other silent voices in the night. Despite the drama and the intrusion of law, the house settled quickly into a piercing quiet, a different kind than before. The silence after violence is never immediate. It lingers, echoing off walls where shouts and blows once resounded, refusing to be replaced by peace until little by little, gentler sounds reclaim the space. Kem drifted through her rooms, as if searching for the threads of her old life, touch lingering on furniture and photographs, each object now both relic and proof. There were days when sunlight poured in, painting the floors gold and pink, and for a minute or two, Kem could believe in good fortune again. Other mornings, the air still seemed heavy, filled with the ghostly presence of words too sharp to forget, accusations still burning into memory. Kenneth filled the spaces as best he could, cooking, cleaning, organizing appointments for counselors, meeting their mother for tea in the garden. He took over the little tasks that, in their monotony, helped stitch a new rhythm into the life of the house. Every evening, Kem confronted her doubts anew. Would the authorities truly deliver justice, or might something be swept conveniently under the carpet? Would David's friends or family come to her door with threats or bribes? Each time, Kenneth answered her with the same patient, steadfast resolve. I'm not going anywhere. We aren't hiding. You are not alone. Justice is slow, but it must come. This time it will. The balance of pain and hope shifted minutely each day, moving the sisters, now just two again, ever closer to something like freedom. In the new light, their laughter resurfaced, awkward at first, then genuine. Sunlight and shadow coexisted, but hope, at last, had found a place to grow. It didn't take long for word of what happened in David's once invincible home to ripple through the neighborhood and beyond. Gossip, righteous and malicious by turns, moved swiftly through social circles, some voices criticizing Kem for speaking, others admiring her courage. Many more, simply shocked that such things could happen in houses like theirs. But among the undercurrent of judgment, there were also soft voices, women reaching out to her with quiet thanks, sharing stories held back for too long, emboldened by her refusal to remain silent. Kenneth, meanwhile, fielded both support and challenge. Old friends and acquaintances sent messages of solidarity or requests for advice. Some men, emboldened by Kenneth's stance, started asking difficult questions at home or within their networks, beginning conversations once stifled in the name of tradition or pride. Others bristled with defensiveness, the age-old cycle of denial and blame circling stubbornly in their minds. Local NGOs and church groups grew bolder, holding forums on domestic abuse, inviting Kem to speak not as a victim, but as a survivor and change-maker. She hesitated, shyness and exhaustion warring with responsibility. But Kenneth assured her, no survivor owed the world anything except their own healing. Still, her story, even when told in fragments and whispers, spilled out and started to shift the community's conversation. For the first time, Kemi's pain was seen not as private shame, but collective challenge. The echo did not end within the walls of her house. It seeped through the city, proof that cycles could be broken, and that silence was no longer the safest choice. As weeks rolled into months, Kem and Kenneth helped each other forge a new life, one not defined by what had been lost, but by what could be built. Legal battles raged on, documents were signed, testimonies given, and the gears of justice continued their slow grind. David faded from their daily world, his presence a cautionary tale rather than a looming threat. Kem poured herself into healing, discovering a quiet courage in therapy sessions and support groups. She learned, sometimes painfully, that forgiveness was not acceptance, and that her worth had never been tied to the violence she endured. Kenneth, freed now from the paralysis of guilt, charted plans for his own future too. He volunteered with at-risk youth, translating lessons of pain and perseverance into hope for the next generation. Together, they rediscovered the joys of ordinary life, shared breakfasts, small celebrations, the persistent comfort of routine. Kem planted new flowers in the garden, tender shoots that symbolized the possibility of beauty after devastation. She forged new friendships and sometimes, tentatively, saw in herself a leader, someone who'd survived and chosen to be more than her wounds. Most important of all, the siblings relearned how to laugh together. It was this laughter, fragile, genuine, and frequent, that finally filled the house with a warmth all its own, a testament to the truth Kenneth had always believed. Victory wasn't the absence of scars, but the strength found in having faced the storm side by side. In the stillness that followed tumult, Kem often wandered the garden barefoot, relishing the earth beneath her toes. It felt like a rite of reconnection, a way to inhabit her own life without apology. She paused by the old hibiscus bush, the one she'd coaxed into bloom over so many seasons. Now its red blossoms glowed with fresh color, impervious to yesterday's storms. In their silent grandeur, Kem found a promise that life roots itself again and again, if only gently tended. Those early mornings, Kenneth sometimes joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea and quiet companionship. They spoke little, simply allowing the dawn to settle between them. The siblings, once bonded by necessity, now discovered new ways to honor their surviving connection, not just through vigilance and rescue, but also through the easy, wordless presence that real trust brings. Kem cherished these moments as sacred. Lessons bloom. For years, she had feared silence, dreading what it might reveal, dreading what it seemed to shroud. But in these sunlit pauses, silence became an ally, a soft container for memory and hope. Sometimes, Kenneth would reach across and touch her hand, not as a shield, but as a brother honoring the miracle that she remained standing, resilient and real. And in these fragments of peace, Kem dared to reclaim her own story. She wrote her thoughts in a hidden journal, tracing out the jagged path from survival towards something she no longer called victory, but simply living. She was more than what had been done to her. She was sister, friend, survivor, and flame carrier for all who doubted the dawn would ever come. It was the unexpected moments of kindness that surprised Kem the most. Sometimes an elderly neighbor would press her palm gently and whisper, "You are stronger than you know." Sometimes familiar faces around the neighborhood, shopkeepers, mothers, even passers-by, would nod quietly, their glances now filled with respect instead of intrigue or pity. The greatest kindness, though, came from children. A little girl from next door left a garland of paper flowers at their gate, scrawled with bright, messy letters, "I hope you are happy." Kem wept at the innocence of it, understanding then that courage could ripple outward, quietly breaking chains never meant for children to learn. These tokens of solidarity built an emotional bridge, helping her cross back into the world of ordinary joys. Kenneth, too, experienced these echoes. Former colleagues, once stoic and closed, now reached for him in new vulnerability, discussing their own unspoken griefs, sometimes asking simply, "How did you keep going?" And so Kenneth learned that his own scars, far from being a source of shame, were a map for others out of darkness. Together, the siblings began to see their healing reflected in the world around them. Kindness, unheralded, persistent, and sometimes born in their wake, became the true measure of the future they'd won. Healing, Kem discovered, was not a straight line. Some nights, sharp memories still sliced through her dreams. Some mornings, her breath caught at stray shadows moving across familiar rooms. The law's gears ground slowly, and she watched with wariness as the system weighed her dignity against David's influence. At times, bitterness threatened to take root. Anger at the years stolen and faith broken. Kenneth understood. He too bore grudges from wars fought and battles lost under unfair banners. But he believed stubbornly that forgiveness was not about absolving the guilty, but freeing the wounded. Side by side in therapy, brother and sister faced the tangled knots within themselves, resentments long buried, fears that still whispered, "It will never change." Forgiveness, they learned, was not a single act, but 1,000 choices made across endless days. It was deciding to greet one another gently each morning, to answer neighbors with patience, to open new doors in the heart, even when yesterday's had slammed shut. It was recognizing that letting go of hate and even the just wish for punishment would not erase wounds, but it would deny the abuser any further claim. With every slow, honest step, forgiveness came more easily. Never perfect, but enough to point the way forward. Healing was now a shared project, sacred and harrowing, but at last possible. Having survived the earthquake of family violence, Kem and Kenneth gradually became architects of new connections. Kem, once withdrawn, welcomed neighbors for coffee and stories. She joined a book club led by other women with secret scars, and found amidst laughter and shared secrets that she could trust herself to build bridges again. Friendship was not without its risks, but she finally saw that opening up could invite light rather than danger. Kenneth expanded his advocacy. He began working with schools and shelters, using his story to break taboos and empower new generations to reject violence and embrace compassion. He cultivated friendships not as a buffer, but as a source of shared accountability and renewed purpose. Together, they realized their lives would always carry echoes of the past, but it was how they used those echoes that truly mattered. Grief and hope, loss and laughter, rage and love. Each emotion had its place in the sturdy bridge they shaped for the future. On weekends, they hosted gatherings, small, joyful affairs filled with food and music, children's games echoing through the rebuilt halls. Here was living proof that even after destruction, community could be reborn, carrying not just one family, but many toward brighter mornings. One evening, as dusk trembled on the horizon and the city's chaos softened into lull, Kenneth and Kem sat together in the garden, the hibiscus glowing, the air filled with the song of crickets. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Kem said quietly, "Do you think we really made it out?" Kenneth stared at the indigo sky, remembering every step of the journey, through darkness, hunger, violence, and finally to this moment of hard-earned peace. He smiled, at first uncertain, then with growing conviction. We did. Not all at once, not always forward. But we're here, and we're free. The words hung in the evening air, transformative and true. Kem leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes to the old fears. They stayed like that until stars pricked the sky, two survivors, two makers of hope, anchored not by what they escaped, but by what they built in its aftermath. Here, in the dark and gentle garden, with their scars and their laughter and love, Kenneth and Kem could finally claim the future as their own. And somewhere in the stillness, the sound of breaking glass faded, replaced at last by the music of belonging.